Russia, which inherited the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons, has the world's biggest store of nuclear warheads.
And because of that, most of those warheads are now outdated.
And with the economic struggles of Russian Federation, how did they maintain such a massive arsenal? Now with the current conflict situation, it's even worse. And
President Vladimir Putin recently said Russia was ready for a nuclear war with the West.
So, are these threats all a bluff? Or is there more to the story of Russian nuclear arsenal?
Russia's nuclear arsenal might be going extinct. Even though Putin likes to make nuclear threats to the West, Russia's actual capabilities are diminishing. Meanwhile, Russia's innovation has come to a standstill, while the US is racing ahead with its Golden Dome. All of this begs the question of how dangerous Putin's nukes actually are to the rest of the world, and what the future of Russia's arsenal looks like. First, to understand Russia's nuclear arsenal, we have to go back to the Soviet era, because that's where most of its modern-day warheads originate from. The Soviets tested their first nuclear device in 1949, also known as RDS-1. They were the first to do so after the US bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the final days of World War II, shocking the world and kickstarting the Cold War. Over the following decades, there was a nuclear arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States. They both expanded their arsenal and made more and more powerful warheads, combined with better ballistic missiles, submarines, and bombers to deliver them. The basic idea was mutually assured destruction. As long as each side could fully destroy the other, there was no incentive to go to war, and both sides would stay safe. At the peak, in 1986, the Soviets had an estimated stockpile of about 45,000 warheads. More than enough to bomb the US and Western Europe into oblivion. The US also had thousands of warheads, enough to decimate all of the population centers in the USSR. But by the 1970s, both realized that this wasn't the most productive way to spend their money, and that this nuclear arms race could easily go wrong. That's why in the Strategic Arms Limitation talks of 1972, both sides agreed to stop making more interceptor missiles, which made it unnecessary to keep making more nuclear warheads. Later, in 1987, the US and the USSR agreed to dismantle thousands of intermediate-range missiles. And shortly before the Soviet Union's collapse, the groundbreaking START I treaty was signed in 1991, which drastically reduced the amount of deployed nuclear warheads to 6,000. So, by the time the Russian Federation was created, its nuclear arsenal was already significantly smaller, and it was shrinking rapidly. This was accelerated by the chaotic situation at the time. But before moving forward, if you think stories like this, stories about global security and hidden realities, need to reach more people, hit like and subscribe. Your support helps ensure critical insights don't get lost in the noise. Now, first of all, the Soviet arsenal was spread out across 4 countries, namely Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Russia wanted to be the only one in the region with a remaining nuclear arsenal, but this required a lot of negotiation with neighboring countries for either the return or the dismantlement of their nukes. Ukraine actually had the 3rd biggest nuclear arsenal in the world at that point, which gave it a lot of strategic leverage even though it didn't have the launch codes, which were in Moscow. But Ukraine was pressured by Russia, the United States, and Europe to give these nukes away in return for security assurances. It's something that Ukraine deeply regrets nowadays because those security assurances weren't legally binding. And now Russia uses the same nukes to threaten Ukraine while invading their territory. But going back to the 1990s, even though Russia became the sole inheritor of the Soviet nuclear arsenal, it could never manage it. A nuclear arsenal is incredibly expansive, and in the 90s, Russia suffered from severe economic problems. This meant that it couldn't maintain all of its nuclear warheads and ballistic missiles, let alone modernize them. Luckily for Russia, though, the United States agreed to continue with nuclear arsenal reductions, which relieved some of the pressure. With the 2003 SORT treaty signed by George W. Bush and Vladimir Putin, both countries agreed to limit their nuclear arsenal even further. By 2012, each would have between 1,700 and 2,000 operationally deployed warheads. And in 2011, the new START treaty was signed, largely to replace the soon-to-expire SORT treaty. The number of operationally deployed warheads was cut by another 10%, to 1,550, and a sophisticated inspections regime was put in place to make sure both parties abided by the rules. On top of that, the amount of deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers was cut to just 700. So it seemed like, slowly but surely, the risk of nuclear war between Russia and the United States was disappearing. Washington shifted its focus to other threats like North Korea and Iran, and in recent years, also the growing threat from China. But over the last decade, everything changed. With the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the intense rivalry between East and West from the Cold War was revived. And the nuclear aspects of this rivalry also got new attention, mostly because of the nuclear threats from President Putin's side. Putin already started to get angry back in 2007, even before the New START treaty was signed. The main reasons were new US anti-missile installations in Europe, allegedly to counter new Iranian missile threats. But theoretically, they could also be used to shoot down Russian ICBMs. In Putin's eyes, this was America's true intention. It could hurt Russia's nuclear deterrence and its mutually assured destruction capability. So, Russia threatened a new Cold War, and it threatened to strike Poland for hosting one of these missile defense installations. Of course, Russia didn't follow through with this, when Poland actually got the installation years later. But Putin's nuclear threat to Ukraine for potentially hosting one of these anti-missile installations did work, and Ukraine decided to abandon these plans. Years later, when Russia annexed Crimea, Putin once again threatened Ukraine with nuclear attacks if it tried to take the peninsula back. The Russian president would later expand his threats to the NATO alliance. In 2018, he warned that the threat of nuclear war should not be underestimated. And in 2019, he told the US that, "I'm ready for another Cuban Missile-style crisis if you want one." A few days later, Russian state TV even broadcasted potential nuclear strike targets in the US. With the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, it only got worse. A few days after the start of the war, Russia put its nuclear deterrent on alert. Eventually, Russia pulled out of the New START treaty, although it continues to abide by the treaty's nuclear restrictions. Meanwhile, Putin has been rambling on about his nuclear threats, to the point where his statements don't even shock anyone anymore. When someone keeps making threats without ever doing anything, it only makes the threats less credible, especially with nuclear threats, because everyone knows that a nuclear exchange ends up in mutually assured destruction. But what if I told you that it's not only Putin's words that are empty? Russia's actual nuclear capability in 2025 might be less lethal than the figures would suggest. First, let's take a look at these figures. Estimates vary, but according to the Federation of American Scientists, Russia has an estimated 5,459 nuclear warheads, of which 1,718 are deployed and ready to be used. That's more than the US, which has an estimated 5,177 nuclear warheads and 1,670 deployed. In a hypothetical nuclear exchange, that would mean all major cities in both countries would be wiped out, and that billions of people would die because of the ensuing nuclear winter. Of course, that's nightmare fuel. But it assumes that Russia is actually able to fire all of its 1,718 nuclear warheads. And that's not really known. First of all, nuclear weapons require maintenance, and a lot of it. People regularly need to inspect and test components of warheads and replace them once they've been degraded. Meanwhile, a critical material called tritium that's used to make fission bombs more powerful has a half-life of only 12 years, so it needs to be replaced every few years to keep the bomb working effectively. On top of that, there's also the launch capability that needs to be maintained, which includes ICBMs, nuclear-armed submarines, and heavy bombers. They need to be tested, refurbished, and modernized continuously, and replaced over a couple of decades. Just as important are the command and control centers and the early warning capabilities. They need to keep up to date and be secure enough to resist cyber attacks. Just to give you a picture of how expansive all of this gets, in the US, the cost of the nuclear forces is expected to be $946 billion in the 2025 to 2034 period, or about $100 billion a year. Over a decade, it includes $228 billion on ballistic missile submarines, $140 billion on ICBMs, $193 billion to support and service the nuclear stockpile, and $154 billion on command, control, and early warning systems. It eats away a big portion of the total defense budget of $850 billion in 2025. It is not just the US which is spending a lot of money on this. In the UK, which has just 120 deployed warheads out of a stockpile of 225, they're spending £6.5 billion, or nearly $9 billion a year on their nuclear capability, also a big portion of their total defense budget. To avoid the costs getting out of hand, they also have to outsource parts of their maintenance, designing, and testing to the US. In France, they do it a little bit cheaper, but they still spend more than $6 billion a year to maintain 290 deployed warheads. Over in China, they spend an estimated $12.5 billion a year to maintain their stockpile of 600 warheads. And according to the Federation of American Scientists, they've only got about 24 that are actually ready to be used. Now, all of this proves a point. Nuclear weapons are incredibly expensive. But in Russia, they're only spending about $8 billion on nuclear weapons, less than the US, less than China, and about as much as the UK. But allegedly, they have 1,718 deployed warheads ready to be fired, and nearly as many nuclear-armed submarines and ICBMs as the US has? So is the Russian arsenal just that much cheaper to maintain? Or are they cutting corners and not doing the maintenance that they should be doing? Of course, wages and the cost of maintaining facilities are lower in Russia than in the United States, but not that much lower, and certainly not lower than in China, which is spending more. So this opens up the possibility that Russia could be a paper tiger. Russia has the nukes and launch capabilities on paper, but it might not actually be doing the necessary maintenance and modernization on all of them. Knowing Russia, it's possible that they're strong on paper, but not nearly as strong in reality, and we don't have to look far to find examples of this. Right at the start of the invasion of Ukraine, Russia should have been able to take over Kyiv in a matter of days, at least on paper. The sheer amount of troops, heavy equipment, and air power should have overwhelmed Ukraine's much smaller forces. But in reality, Russia failed due to incredibly poor logistics, maintenance, and training. One of the reasons for this was misreporting. Officers told their higher-ups that their units were prepared and that their equipment was in good shape, when in reality that wasn't true at all. There was also widespread corruption and graft in the ranks of the Russian military, driven in part by low salaries. Now, all of these problems might also be happening with the nuclear arsenal. Military personnel can just say they're doing maintenance without actually doing it. Just like with the conventional capabilities, this can lead the Russian military to claim to have much stronger nuclear capabilities than it actually has. In a way, it's easier to do this with nukes, because everybody hopes and believes that they're never going to be used. So as long as you can keep the appearance, you're fine. Add to that the fact that Russia never tested a single nuclear warhead after the fall of the Soviet Union, and that it doesn't test its ICBMs, nuclear-armed submarines, and heavy bombers nearly as often as the US. This means that there's less accountability and less of a need to be prepared. All in all, Russia might have fewer nukes that are capable of bombing the US and Europe than the 1,718 figure of deployed nukes. What the actual numbers are is pure speculation, and you really can't know. In a way, it doesn't even matter that much, because even if Russia manages to launch 1,000, that's still devastating. And because the US is able to respond by wiping out Russia completely, we'll never find out how strong Russia actually is. However, it's very interesting to look at the future of Russia's nuclear capabilities. That's because things like aging and underinvestment compound, to the point where Russia might be way less scary in a few decades from now than it is in the moment. In some scenarios, the Russian nuclear threat might be gone completely. You see, it's not only maintenance, but also innovation that's necessary to keep a credible nuclear deterrent. You need to have up-to-date ICBMs, submarines, bombers, missile defenses, and detection systems to be dangerous. Russia clearly doesn't have the money and the resources for all of that, and this is not mere speculation. Back in 2013, Russia started working on the massive Sarmat ICBM to replace an outdated Soviet version called the Voyvoda ICBM, which was manufactured in Ukraine in the 1970s. The Sarmat missile was supposed to be an invincible weapon, better than any of Russia's existing ICBMs. It's supposed to be able to launch 10 heavy or 15 lighter, independently targetable warheads all at once, combined with decoys and jammers. It's also supposed to carry the Avangard hypersonic glide vehicle, a high-speed maneuvering warhead that's nearly impossible to intercept. On top of all that, the ICBM won't take the regular route to the US over the Arctic or over Europe, but over the South Pole, where there are no US defenses. But the development of the Sarmat ICBM is not going great, to say the least. Last year, a major test of the Sarmat missile ended up in catastrophic disaster. Satellite images showed that the ICBM fell back to the ground close to the launch site, creating a 200-foot or 60-meter wide crater. Obviously, that's not nuclear warhead foolproof. Out of 4 tests of the Sarmat missile, only 1 test back in 2022 has actually succeeded. So clearly, Russia is facing major bottlenecks in actually making this new missile after 12 years of development. The missile was supposed to enter service back in 2018. Currently, Putin claims that the Sarmat is already in service, but this would be unprecedented considering how poorly it has been tested. The Voyvoda missile it was supposed to replace was successfully tested 36 times before going into service. So the Russian government is clearly getting desperate, and there are lots of reasons for this. The defense sector that's responsible for making and designing these missiles is suffering under the impact of international sanctions. They can't sell their products to many foreign countries anymore. and they can't buy crucial components from Western markets. For things like chips and machinery, these defense companies are now fully dependent on China. As a result of the sanctions, the missile manufacturers have suffered a big financial hit, and they're increasingly relying on debt to meet the government's demands. Meanwhile, the massive brain drain in Russia means that many engineers are gone, and there's also huge labor shortages in manufacturing that have hit the defense sector. These things are not unique to Russian missile manufacturers. In general, the Russian defense industry is facing what's called innovation stagnation. And one of the worst fields out there to have innovation stagnation is missile defense. This is not often discussed enough because it's very hard to intercept ballistic missiles. But it's not impossible, especially as technology improves. Now, the US has tried to get missile defense before to neutralize the Soviet nuclear threat. Back in 1983, President Ronald Reagan launched the Strategic Defense Initiative to try and intercept ballistic missiles. The Pentagon started to study things like lasers, particle beam weapons, and even space-based interceptors. As a joke, people started to call it the Star Wars program. However, because it was eating away at so much funding, and because the Cold War ended, it was eventually downsized. But more than 4 decades later, technology is on a whole new level. That's why President Trump signed an executive order to construct a Golden Dome, with a goal to detect and destroy ballistic, hypersonic, and cruise missiles. If this works, it would put the world upside down. Suddenly, Russia won't have anything to threaten the US with. And if Russia doesn't develop a similar system, the United States gets unparalleled strategic leverage. Now, there are solid arguments as to why the Golden Dome could actually work. The Golden Dome plans to use a global constellation of satellites and space-based interceptors in low Earth orbit to intercept ballistic missiles before they go for re-entry. This was already proposed in the Reagan years, but now it's infinitely cheaper to achieve this, all thanks to Elon Musk's SpaceX. While there might be political problems between Trump and Musk right now, the strategic advantage is undeniable. With Falcon 9, the king of satellite launches, the cost per kilogram of payload to low Earth orbit is about $2,000 to $4,000. That's nothing compared to the legacy systems. With the space shuttle, it was more in the $60,000 to $80,000 range, adjusted for inflation. That's a huge difference, especially when you're going to launch thousands upon thousands of satellites to create a global interceptor network. In the 80s, this was simply too expensive, but now it's feasible. It could even get better. If the new Starship project will work, it changes the satellite game completely. The rocket is absolutely massive and intended to be fully reusable, which means that the cost per kilogram could drop to a mere $67. But that's according to SpaceX. Other, more conservative estimates still price it at around $200. This doesn't only make space-based interceptors feasible, it also makes them the most cost-effective option. The Missile Defense Agency already gets a budget of $11 billion a year, mainly to combat rogue nations like North Korea and possibly Iran. For this price, the US gets about 44 ground-based interceptors, and realistically, you need 3 to 5 interceptors per ICBM to have a high probability of a kill. So the US is spending billions a year to defend against just a handful of ICBMs. With those same billions, you could launch hundreds of space-based interceptors. All this circles back to Russia. Although it doesn't make it impossible for Russia to hit the US, it puts a lot of pressure on them. It might even be enough pressure to break the country. You see, to keep up with American interceptors, Russia would have to build and maintain more and more ICBMs, which would cost tens, if not hundreds, of billions of dollars. And Russia clearly does not have the money for this, nor the production capacity. Also, if the Golden Dome works like planned, it's going to be cheaper for the US to add interceptors than it is for Russia to add ICBMs. So Russia won't be able to keep up in the long term. Meanwhile, Russia can forget about making their own Golden Dome, because they are rapidly falling behind in space. In 2024, the US had 145 orbital launch attempts. China had 68, while Russia only had 17. All of these 17 launches are directed by Russia's struggling state-owned enterprises like Roscosmos, which are underfunded and lagging behind the rest of the world in terms of cost per launch. And because private industry is struggling in Russia, it's unlikely that a SpaceX-style company will emerge there. China has a better chance to copy the US with space-based interceptors, but Russia also can't afford to become fully dependent on China for defense. To end the video, let's not forget that Russia's nuclear force is still incredibly dangerous, but Putin's nuclear arsenal is already deteriorating. Slowly but surely. Eventually, it won't be in the same league as the US anymore, both in terms of scale and sophistication. And if missile defense finally works, it might be the end of the story for Russia's supposedly invincible weapons. That's why, in the long term, Russia's nuclear arsenal might be going extinct. If you want to keep updated on topics like this, please don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.